Oh, hello, it's you again. I'm sorry, I knew I would forget your name, but I hope you feel welcome all the same. Oh, I made a rhyme. Now, last time I asked for viewers to send thoughts, topics, and questions to cover in this show. We had many responses. Perhaps you will hear your question asked or topic covered, but if you don't, hopefully you will another time. And of course, feel free to suggest more at thephilosophish.com. Some of the topics may be difficult. You may agree, you may disagree. So if you would like to leave thoughts in the comments, you may. Just try to be kind to each other. So, as promised, we have invited a guest to talk with us. So allow me to warmly welcome social psychologist Dr. Dina McMillan. Dina, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Phil. I'm glad to be here.
Wonderful. Let's start with your academic origins. Where did you study?
I actually went for undergraduate to Hunter College in New York. And then for graduate school, I have a master's and a doctorate from Stanford University in California.
Okay, I imagine that was quite competitive. What was the application process like?
Well, you had to write an essay along with your application. And fortunately for me, someone gave me some very good advice. I had a really high academic average as an undergraduate because I studied and worked all the time. This person, however, said, don't bother trying to make yourself sound smart on your application. It's probably a bunch of old guys that are going to be reading your application. Do you know anything that would appeal to them? And I thought about the fact that I had left college and gone back, but I left to become a model in Paris and New York.
Oh.
So that's what I put on my application, thinking a bunch of old guys would find it appealing.
That is good thinking, Dina.
What I didn't put on my application is my race, because I always wanted to do something very public with my education, and I didn't want anyone to say, you only got into Stanford because you are affirmative action, because they felt like they had to have Black graduate students. So they didn't know I was Black until I showed up.
Okay. Was your race an issue during your time there? Were things made difficult for you?
It was very challenging. Surprisingly, for a university in California, I faced something I was not expecting, and that was very overt racism, and not from my colleagues, from my professors.
Okay.
If I asked a question in class, I was not answered or responded to in any way. If I had an appointment to meet with a professor, they just wouldn't show up. In fact, right before I graduated, they finally appointed a female chair of my department, and she asked me point blank, how do you handle being treated so differently than everyone else? Of course, I told her, eyes on the prize, that there had been people who had been set on by dogs, hanged from trees, beaten, all so I could get the opportunity to get an education. They'd done it and they didn't know me. They did it for a stranger. So how could I complain just for being shunned, which I won't lie, it was extremely challenging. But compared to the physical danger others had gone through, I knew I had to make my contribution as well, and that was it.
Oh. I wonder, were you able to challenge your professors on their behavior towards you?
Absolutely. Now, not my first year there because I didn't know enough, but they taught us all sorts of things like how to really understand the methodology of research studies and advanced statistical analysis. And so when they were standing up in front of us and saying, well, you know, the studies show, that Black people just aren't as smart as white people, I had the knowledge to go immediately to the methodology and refute that. Tell the professors that's not what it says. And the methodology on this study is so flawed. Do you have another reason for using this against us? Knowledge is power if it's put into action, but only if it's put into action.
So how were you able to use your knowledge after university? College.
Well, it was university because I was in graduate school. And I know, Phil, that, being a British fish, you might not understand how our system works.
I am in Britain, I think. People say I have an accent, though I can't remember where I'm from originally.
Well, I would say this, that afterwards, I worked with a lot of non-government organizations
Okay.
and as a volunteer in women's shelters and in domestic violence. It's interesting because I hadn't expected it when I graduated from Stanford, but not long after that, domestic violence became a big part of where I saw my knowledge to be needed. And there was a huge gap between what was needed and what was being offered.
So how were you able to address that gap?
Well, what I did was I actually developed one of the only prevention programs for domestic violence still in the world. It's called Unmasking the Abuser. And it's an education program that very simply explains the exact tactics used by abusers to lure in and trap their partners in a relationship.
How can people avoid getting into one of these relationships?
One of the things I recommend is that when they go out with someone, to just, even if they only take control of one thing. So in my book, in my new book, the woman is going on a date with a guy who's, takes her to a place that he knows well. He orders the special because he's sure she'll like it. They sit where he wants to sit. And she remembered that I had said that if you continue to do that, your brain will actually adapt and perceive that person as an authority over you. So it's important that you find something where you assert your own will. So when the server comes and asks if they want dessert, he speaks for both of them and says no. And she interjects and said, actually, yes, I would. And she just orders a little bowl of some citrus fruits.
Nice.
The point wasn't that she really wanted dessert. The point was that she was going to make her own decisions. And that can keep your brain separate enough from this other person. It can actually shield you. Little things like that.
What does the research say about who is at risk?
I would say there are several groups that are very at risk, but as a Black American woman, I was quite sensitive to the fact that Black American women have extremely high rates of serious domestic violence and the highest murder rates in the United States. They are the most at risk of being murdered by an intimate partner, current or former. So I took the basic knowledge from Unmasking the Abuser and from my first book, But He Says He Loves Me, and I'm now completing a follow-up book that includes cultural norms specifically to help Black American women.
So, to consider manipulation in general, how is it different from persuasion, simply?
Persuasion is giving you information you may not have. It's getting you excited about something. It's giving you knowledge. Manipulation is doing the same thing, but what you're showing people may not be true or may not be the whole story. Manipulation also involves using emotion to keep people from getting enough time to make a decision, punishing them perhaps with ostracism or protests if they ask questions, and removing their right after they get the information to say no. Persuasion convinces them to say yes but they get to choose. Manipulation takes that choice away.
So, returning to your treatment in college, do you feel things are different nowadays?
I would say yes, definitely. Racism is less extreme than it was since I was in university, but I'm not sure if the recent efforts are going to make it better or worse.
Okay.
Racism was actually declining pretty steadily, but the methods being used by some of the groups, well meaning or not, I fear are going to make the racial groups so divided that it's going to take a long time to get back to even where we are now.
So, regarding such efforts, maybe, a lot of people ask questions about Bloom. What is Bloom?
Blum. Phil, do you mean Black Lives Matter?
I don't know.
Yes, we're talking about Black Lives Matter. Well, Black Lives Matter is more complicated than it may seem. It it's a slogan that Black Lives Matter, which is something that I think many people of color wanted to reinforce because so often we've been treated as though our lives don't matter. But it's also a protest movement and a grassroots protest movement, and it's a political movement. It has a political arm. I think that anyone who wants to get involved in Black Lives Matter, just believing that Black Lives Matter and Brown Lives Matter and White Lives Matter is not enough.
Okay.
Look them up online. See what they stand for. Look at their political arm. What are they aiming for?
Oh.
If their goals are consistent with your own, fine. But if not, I think you should really think about whether you should get involved with them.
What do you think is the best way to make people aware of important issues?
I think if you believe in something, there is absolutely nothing wrong with drawing attention to it, with using mechanisms like storytelling or music to highlight an issue that people may be unaware of. If you look at the civil rights movement that happened in the 1950s and the 1960s in the United States, I've read so many accounts that said the fact that people were seeing the brutality that was being used against the protesters on their televisions every night in their homes made people make a stronger stance. It made it real for the average Jane or Joe that probably had no real direct experience with racism or bias or police violence. But if you use manipulation rather than persuasion, there's always a huge risk because if people find out they've been manipulated, they will turn against you.
Okay, well, let's say you agree with the larger message of a group. Does it matter if that group is being manipulative?
If you think, okay, I'm only going to get involved a little bit because I agree with the organization about this one point, that is known in social psychology as the foot in the door. The people who are organizing often will tell you, hey, you can just get involved in this tiny little thing over here. You don't have to get involved in the wider issues if that's not something you believe in, because they know how the brain works. They know that if they can get you to make a small commitment to them, that if they can increase and keep asking for increasingly large commitments, the probability is good that step by step, they're going to walk you further and further into the organization. Even if you believe in some of the points, you have to be very careful about linking yourself with any group, any organization, any company whose beliefs you don't share. They are not going to let you get away with staying on the periphery. They will put enormous pressure on you to get increasingly involved. And unfortunately, psychologically, your own brain is going to help them.
So, what is an example? Oh, excuse me. Okay, I'm back. What is an example of present-day racism that people would do well to recognize? Oh, my goodness. I am so sorry.
Phil, you're so cute. I agree that racism still exists. I agree that systemic racism isn't completely obliterated. Now, systemic racism looks at the foundations of organizations and to see if the racist bias is actually built into the system. Now, if you went back to 1950, it would be easy to see. Banks, for instance, in the United States actually had written policy that they didn't hide that said they were not going to give mortgages to Black people. So even Black people with good jobs had to actually save up enough to buy the house outright. So you can imagine what that did for Black home ownership in the United States. But the problem is this: people think if the laws changed, then the system's changed. And that's not necessarily the case. It leaves a shadow. Often, a lot of the rules will stay in place or will change just a little, even if the overall law says it's no longer allowed.
So, do you have an approach to tackling these issues?
I actually developed a program to address bias, all kinds of bias: racial bias, ethnic bias, bias against short people, bias against fish.
Oh, really?
Okay, that was a joke. I haven't included anything about fish,
Oh.
but I do have a program called Healing the Rift, and it's an anti-bias program that does tackle racism. And I put it together because I wanted to address bias, but not preach hatred, not blame people for things their ancestors did, not blame them for things they subconsciously do, just to draw all of our attention to bias, whether we know it or not, recognize it or not, like it or not, and teach people what to do about it.
Super. Well, Dina, I think we'll finish there. So I will say goodbye to you, but thank you again so much for joining us.
Oh, you're welcome, Phil. And if you need me, just let me know. I'd be happy to come back and speak with you again.
Ah, wonderful. So, that was Dr. Dina McMillan. As she mentioned, she has a book and a podcast series that aim to help women avoid being trapped in manipulative relationships. The book is called But He Says He Loves Me, and the podcast series is Unmasking the Abuser. And thank you for joining us. Wherever you are in the world, I hope you are safe, you are well, and I give you a big kiss. Mwah. And do remember to hit the notification button so that we can meet again. Goodbye for now.